Welcome to our talk. My name is Luann Cinnamon, and I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors, Limor Tamim, Samuel Dodson, and Heather O'Brien, all from the University of British Columbia, Canada, which is located on the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. Our motivation for this talk started with a question that was the basis for Limor's master's thesis. We wanted to understand how a searcher's interest or disinterest in the search topic affected their behavior and search outcomes. To do that work, we first asked the question, well, what is interest anyway? And when Limor began reading to answer this question, it soon became clear that while interest is often referenced and even measured in studies of interactive IR, there is little substantial work on interest in our field, and there are limited connections with the extensive theoretical and empirical work on interest in fields like psychology and education. This disconnect led us to this perspectives paper, which revisits the notion of interest in interactive information retrieval. So, what did we do? The paper is essentially a review and a synthesis paper. We looked at research on interest in educational psychology, which dates back more than 100 years to John Dewey's classic 1913 work, Interest and Effort in Education. We drew heavily on the work of Hiddie and Renninger, whose book that you can see the cover of here, The Power of Interest for Motivation and Engagement, provides an excellent overview of the topic. This book is more written for lay audiences, but it draws upon extensive research on the topic of interest. And another scholar, Paul Sylvia's work is quite well known. He focuses on interest as an emotion, and Sylvia's work has already had some uptake within the IR community. We also reviewed theoretical and methodological approaches to interest in our own field, and that included examining the methods in about 60 different papers that we gathered through the repository of assigned search task and through tasks, which is an open repository that includes many examples of search tasks used in user studies, and through general literature searching. So we really tried to pull together both what has been done in our field and what has been done in other fields and kind of bring them in conversation one with the other. So let's dive into this question of what is interest? So interest is a construct that characterizes a relationship between an individual and semantic content. What is especially important about interest is that it functions as a motivational factor. It encourages people to spend time and effort interacting with content. As such, we argue that it should be of central importance to the cheer community, and especially important to those working, for example, in the searching as learning area. A second point is that two types of interest phenomena have been identified, although these are often conflated in interactive information retrieval. Type A is individual interest, and this is really a disposition towards particular types of content. This is what we sometimes refer to as interests, as in my interests include hockey, Victorian literature, and fashion blogs. Individual interest is idiosyncratic, and it's internally driven and develops over time through repeated interaction with content. Individual interest is associated with knowledge and expertise, given that repeated exposure to materials on a particular topic. And it also has been shown to develop into an important component of self-identity in some cases, as we can see with serious hobbyists or sports enthusiasts, for example. Now, Hiddie and Renninger have developed a model of how individual interests develop over time. And sometimes they fade over time as well, and sometimes they last a lifetime. The second type of interest is state interest. This is a psychological and emotional state experienced when interacting with content, as in, oh, this is interesting, let me read more. State interest is a moment in time phenomenon, which is characterized by increased attention, effort, concentration, and positive affect. Are these two types of interest related? Yes, they can be. Individual interest, for example, could be a factor in triggering a state of interest or state interest, but it may not need to be present for state interest to occur. State interest can arise situationally due to features of the content, and we may become interested in material that we've never had an interest in before. And so that's a bit of an overview of definitionally of interest. What we wanted to do in this paper is to pull this framing of interest into the interactive information retrieval context. And so we offer this conceptual model in the paper. This model, we want to acknowledge, this is not modeling all kinds of search or all cases of search, but particularly those where state interest is triggered, which is, absolutely certainly not all kinds of searches would involve that scenario. So if we start on the left in this model and we take a typical scenario in which search arises in the context of a broader work task or situation, the task topic may give rise to an individual interest or a situational interest or both. So an individual interest would be cases where it connects to some kind of longer term or emerging individual interest. And a situational interest may be triggered by features of the content. For example, in Sylvia's work, he notes that novelty and complexity are factors in triggering interest. And then as the search session proceeds, searchers interact with content, appraising it for its interest features, and as they continue to interact with the content, it gives rise to positive affect. So this is a sense of progress, perceptions of competence. These are all motivational factors which encourage attention and effort, which over time increases the learning that takes place in the search, because learning, we know, is associated with effort on the part of the learner. So this is a reinforcing cycle which helps to maintain the state of interest throughout the session. Motivation is key in this model, as is the distinction between individual and state interest. So for example, it makes sense to measure individual interest prior to the search session, because that's dependent on a longer term pattern within that individual. But it really only makes sense to measure state interest during the session if you're able to, or post session as people reflect back on, because it's very difficult for someone to know prior to the search whether they will in fact experience interest during the session. One other thing to note, as you can see here, I've highlighted that extrinsic motivational variables may be involved in influencing a search. So interest isn't the only motivational variable. There are many things. For example, you may be highly motivated to complete a search in order to achieve some objective or to get a good grade if you're searching in a learning context. And so we're not claiming that interest is the only motivational factor, but it is an important intrinsic motivational factor. In the paper itself, you'll find several sections that focus on the conceptualization of interest in interactive information retrieval, and a discussion of how it's been manipulated through search tasks and measured in research studies. However, in this talk, we're going to jump straight past that to a quick overview of some of the issues and recommendations from the paper. So the first of these is conceptual and theoretical clarity. We want to encourage people to move beyond commonplace notions of interest. When interest is included in a study, it should be defined and linked to a theoretical context, because interest is a construct. Not all researchers of interest think about it in the same way. A key thing is to distinguish between individual and state interest and identify which kind of interest you're studying and why. You may be looking at it holistically, but these are different phenomena and should be identified as such. A third point is essentially to avoid reinventing the wheel. There's so much prior empirical work on interest that is relevant to our field. There's also some excellent recent work within our field that can be drawn upon, particularly in studies that focus on the user experience. Examples are work by Frans van der Sloos and his colleagues that draw upon Sylvia's research, examining the relationship between interest, novelty, and complexity. There are also several works by Ioannis Arapakis and colleagues that look at interest as a component of user engagement, and work by our own co-author Heather O'Brien and colleagues that examine interest, task complexity, and user engagement. So there is a growing body of work within our field to draw upon. The second point is when we're thinking about interest as an explanatory variable, as I said, there hasn't been a lot of work in our field that have really looked at the impact of interest, but there is a great deal of evidence from other fields, from educational psychology, that interest is positively correlated with effort, comprehension, cognition, learning, and positive information experiences. So we really should be considering the influence of interest on search. However, it is absolutely challenging to isolate and manipulate interest in user studies because it's a subjective phenomena, and it's correlated also with many other factors such as prior knowledge, task complexity, satisfaction, ease, and user engagement. These are often measured together, but what we're lacking right now is some good models of the relationships between these factors. We need to find ways to design studies that we can also isolate, manipulate, and control these factors. In the meantime, Edwards and Kelly's work, which offers a method to identify and assign participants with both high and low interest tasks, is a good model to build on. We need to remember to be measuring interest after the task, it possibly in addition to before the search task takes place. But this is a good approach. In our field, we've relied quite heavily on trying to always assign interesting search tasks in user studies. And I think we need to move beyond that to be looking at both high and low interest tasks. The third point is measuring interest. And there are many challenges to this, some of which I've just mentioned. The key priority is to develop a validated scale for measuring interest as a theoretical construct. The majority of studies done now are using a single self-report measure, asking people to rate how interesting is this topic, or how interesting did you find this search. So, and these sort of single item ratings are not adequate, in part because interest is a multifaceted construct. We want to be able to distinguish between both kinds of interest and to be using a robust measure. Our team has taken some steps towards this in the instruments that Limor developed and used in her thesis research, which included both pre- and post-task questions about interest and included a three item scale for measuring state interest, but more validation is needed with a larger sample. We think that within interactive information retrieval, we can still benefit from qualitative research on interest, as we don't really know yet enough about the role it plays during search. And finally, a major step in studying interest, and this is across all disciplines, is to complement self-report measures with behavioral, physiological, and neurological measures. We still have a ways to go to be able to use these measures effectively in the case of interest, but that's a goal. And finally, just to wrap up, we've encouraged you to consider interest as a source of motivation that contributes to positive information experiences and outcomes. The goal of this paper is to contribute to a shift in the field, which has already begun, towards a more sophisticated treatment of interest, and open up the work from educational psychology for application in interactive information retrieval. We made the case that conceptual and methodological clarity and consistency is needed in research to move towards an understanding of the role of interest within the complex web of variables that shape IIR experiences. We'd like to thank you for your interest and attention.